thank you so much for inviting me, Brad, and thank you to Josh, who's busy with the holidays right now. It's a real privilege to be able to be here with all of you, and as Brad said, share my perspective and also have a chance to talk after each case study I'm showing you, and hear from you guys. I'm sort of selfishly here also to learn from you, because Brad and I were just talking earlier about how we feel like we're babies learning to walk in this profession. We're at the very beginnings of it, and every week there feels like there's a new development or a new lesson learned, and so it's an incredibly dynamic place to be, and at the same time scary. So I'm sharing sort of what we've learned to date and continue to learn. So just excited to be here today, tell you a little bit about my background, my story, and the work that we're doing, which combines the idea of storytelling in three-dimensional spaces, which I don't think has been cracked yet. We're trying to crack it in many different ways. So I'll start by sharing my screen. Okay. Can you guys all see this?
Looks great.
Right, perfect, great. So it's called the Crossroads of Space and Storytelling. So I'm going to be looking at different ways to tell very different kinds of stories in spaces, lots of variety of different spaces. And also what story is. It's sort of a word that's used almost as much, or maybe as much, as the word immersive, which I still love. But I really want to sort of try to articulate at least our perspective at Lorem Ipsum on storytelling. And so a little bit about me. I come from the northwest of England, a little tiny village with a 1,000-year-old oak tree. Never fully appreciated it until I came to New York. So we did a school trip when I was about 11 down to London, and I went into the Tate Gallery, and some of you may be familiar with the Seagram murals by Mark Rothko. I was not. I just sort of walked in there tagging along, and sat down and was absolutely consumed, bowled over, mesmerized by this room. And I ended up sitting there for about 45 minutes till the teacher thought they'd lost me and came and dragged me away. And when I look back, I don't know if any of you guys have ever looked back at key moments in your past, I realized that this was a moment where I was overwhelmed in a three-dimensional space, and something really resonated with me, and I had a transcendental emotional moment that I've never forgotten. So I think this had a big effect on me. And so I was chose to study painting actually up in Newcastle. So my background is very, very visual. I'm an artist. I'm, with a little bit of chagrin, nearly studied architecture because I also like math a lot. So I have like right left side brain thing going on. So, but unfortunately the curriculum was cement the first 6 months. So I said, no way am I going to sit and learn about cement. So unfortunately went the pathway of fine art, and started to play around with light and color and time and space in my art, and then came to America because I started to look at experiential filmmaking, ironically with no narrative to start with. And I thought, oh, I really, really sort of like this visually, but I need to understand the technology of how these tools work. How does a video camera work? How does the sound work? How does editing work? So that I could understand the craft to be able to translate that into my art and what it was I was trying to say. So I did my master's in film and television production, and then naively came to New York, where I set up a production company. Again, not a great idea when you don't know anybody and you don't really have any money to start your own company. I don't advise anyone try that. It's much better to learn from professionals, gain experience and clientele, and then go out there. But what it did do is it enabled us to understand and start pitching our own commercials, drawing the storyboards, understanding how to tell narrative stories for brands over 30 seconds traditionally. And then as time's gone on, either over 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 2 minutes, 10 minutes, documentaries and narrative feature films. So really focusing a lot on how to tell stories. This is just sort of a quick example of a few sort of varieties that we bring together, because our company Lorem Ipsum now shoots everything and anything in the air, under the water. We have all 3D animators in-house on staff, 2D animators. We've shot all around the world for tons of different brands. So that's sort of how our media production started to evolve. And again, we're really interested in long form as well as short form. So we're producing Kristen Stewart's directorial debut called The Chronology of Water. That's in post right now. But just to give you a sort of an idea of our background and where, when we say story, we think very much about visual stories, visual narratives. So slowly our work started to go into more digital narratives. That could be using AR, VR, projections in museums, institutions, for brands, on websites, but always looking at, you know, what's the essence of the story that you're trying to tell, what's the beginning, middle, and end, and I'll go into that in a minute. So we see storytelling as the best way to reach people, move people, but it can take many different forms. The company's grown over the last 24 years. It's now throughout the world, and is made up, it's truly multidisciplinary. It's made up of everybody from directors, script writers, content creators. We have a huge technology staff who are looking at all of the programming that we do, and then a lot of artists making a lot of the media and helping us tell the stories. So that's a little bit about me and my background. But if you think about storytelling, it really is one of the most basic human characteristics. It was there at the very beginning. It's sort of, I think, what differentiates us from all the other animals on the planet is our need to be able to share stories. It started off way back again. This is from one of the French caves, but they're also in Australia. It all originated with visual stories. This was before we had language. We always wanted to try to communicate events, things that were happening to us. And then from that, it shifted to more oral traditions as language and the spoken word started to develop. And then in England, we had strolling minstrels. So in different countries and different continents, there were the people who would go around and share stories and share histories and pass on what we now refer to as traditions and history. And even some folklores and fables and fairy tales. So that's sort of how storytelling started. And again, it's sort of like part of who we are. It's obviously shifted, and it's got longer narratives. As soon as you had alphabets and written words, and then stories started happening that way with Quill. And then you have technology, which really advanced how we started to tell stories when you think about typewriters, and then the computers. And so you start to see this move to storytelling and technology becoming sort of synonymous, which really helped us to tell stories now in ways that we couldn't do ever before. And in spaces, it allows us to tell it in spaces that we never needed to do. And obviously things like, it started off with photography, then cinema, videos, now we have blogs, it's on our phone, it's projection mapping on buildings, it's everywhere around us. But again, what's really key are stories. And so I just want to say, so why are stories effective though? And so one of the key things about, well, there's 3 key things really. It's that emotional connection, right? When you get into a story and emotionally invested, you're more likely to have that response. It's like, here I have that heart racing. It could be the tightening the stomach. It could be the opposite. It could be that something that resonates, excites you, excites wonder, or fear or nostalgia. It really, when you have that emotive response to a story, it helps solidify the memory and the feeling. It also scientifically activates your brain. So stories are really sort of activate different areas of the brain, specifically those associated with language processing and visual imagery. And that really helps to strengthen your neural network to, again, help store information. So there is actually a chemical reason why stories are effective and why we have this need to tell them. And then obviously empathy. We talk about it a lot on our podcast, Masters of Experience, that I co-host with Brenda Cowan, relating to characters in a story. And having the story not necessarily be about yourself. So it could be about, it doesn't always have to be a good person, right? It could be a bad person, but there's things about that character that you relate to so that you can experience what somebody's gone through to really help you foster that empathy and understanding. So stories really enable you to be able to do that and walk in people's shoes you haven't walked in before and understand some of the trials and tribulations they've faced, and then reflect back on who you are and some of the things that you face in your life. So museums, when you think about storytelling, you turn to museums. These are primarily spaces and places for communication. I know we say this often. And I really feel like one of the best forms of communication are stories, again, because they help us understand other people and empathize with them. And I think one of the things that we're all constantly struggling, not just right now in the world, but always seem to be struggling with as a human race, is empathy and understanding. And so I think that this is an amazing, museums are an amazing space and place to be able to tell stories, to help people understand each other. So when you look at the key factors of what a story is, earlier I mentioned it's a word that's bandied around a lot, and you'll probably find millions of different people saying what a story is. But for us and what we do, we think about it as it has to have a plot with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has to have a setting. Where is it primarily set? Who are the characters? What's the point of view of the characters? Or whoever's speaking to you, and what's the conflict? Obviously, sometimes there's a protagonist, an antagonist. Drama is all about conflict and resolution, These are the ways that you tell a story, and these are the ways that you draw out the empathy, the understanding, really resonate and create emotions from your visitors. This will feel very film-like or novel-like, but these are still, for us as we're working on our spaces, the questions that we ask at the very, very, very beginning before we do any planning. And so how do you tell a story? You understand what a story is, you understand the elements of a story. How do you tell a story in a 3D space? And as I mentioned earlier with my, babies learning to walk, this is by no means an answer. This is a partial answer to a question that I believe we're all wrestling with. As technology evolves, as we can tell these stories in different ways in 3D spaces, it's an incredibly exciting time. So what I'm just going to share with you is some of the answers that we had in some of our case studies. And I'm excited to hear about your answers and how you've solved some of the problems with like moving people through a space, if you have a linear story as opposed to one which you can randomly access. If you want to tell a more linear story, if you want to, how do you do that while still enabling people to miss chapters and miss moments? Because one of the differences with a museum as opposed to watching a film or reading a book is it's most definitely usually not linear. And so how do you tell a dramatic story where people can pop in and out? How do you keep that thread going is definitely one of our biggest challenges. And then how do you tell the story with the different tools that we have available? If it's a hands-on physical interactive, if it's media, if it's projection, if it's interactives, if it's AR, VR, AI, you name it. What are the best things that you need to tell that story? And so we often start with, what's that story point? What are you trying to say? What are the emotion and understanding of the moment that you want the visitor to have? And we start our projects there. We never go in saying, oh, this will be a piece of media, this will be an artifact. The only difference with artifacts is, and you'll see in some of my case studies, is in stories, if you're telling one in 5 seconds, 15 seconds, or 2 hours, People cannot concentrate and focus for long moments of time. You just can't. And when you are really creating emotions in people, they are intense and they are fleeting, and people need to rest. So as with the drama in a story goes up and down for a reason, like for example, in Psycho, you don't have the shower moment throughout. You have these moments of suspense and then the action and the drama. The same thing when you're telling a story in a space, you have to make sure that when you have an intense moment, that there is a moment for reflection afterwards, a moment maybe to sit down afterwards. Maybe the design is a lot less heavy, maybe it's simpler, just places where people can think, reflect, compose themselves. So just like in a story in 3D space, you need those as well. And then obviously, we're talking about inclusive design, universal design. How do you make sure that these stories are accessible to everybody, which is, you know, the challenge that we all face, and how do you do that? And then the other issue is when you come into a 3D space and you're telling a story, some of your visitors will know some things about that story already, others will not. And so when you're telling the story, being able to make sure, primarily it's a challenge through media, how deep do you go, how much do you put in there? And my big mantra to all the curators or executive directors at museums is less is more. Always less is more, whatever it is you're doing, when you're telling a story, because it will really resonate and hit hard. So again, when you're thinking about story in a museum or in a space, really focus. You have to leave things out. And I think that's always the challenge, and the challenge to persuade your clients to leave things out, or not throw everything in the kitchen sink and all the stories into interactives. We've had that a few times too. So the first project I'd like to share with you was a museum, a brand new museum. We were brought in after the building had been designed and was finishing completion in the build on the outside. This was an exciting project because it was about a woman, and you don't often get museums made about women. So this was about a lady called Zoya. It was set in the 1940s, right before World War II, in a town a couple of hours outside Moscow. And the story was about her, and she was just graduating high school right when the Blitzkrieg happened and the Nazis were sweeping through Russia. So basically overnight she was changed from a girl looking forward to going to university, going to study, full of optimism and hope, to being in a war-torn country when all of the 17 and 18-year-olds were enlisted into the army, into battalions. They had 3 days to learn the ropes, learn what they needed to do, and then they were all sent out to fight on different sorts of missions. 98% of them were killed within 2 weeks. So it's huge. It was horrific, basically. And she is a hero because in her mission that she was sent on, she was caught by the Nazis, who tortured her in the snow overnight to give up the location of her battalion and the rest of her regiment, and she refused to. They beat her up, and she didn't even tell them her real name. She told them nothing. And it was all set in this town that you see in front of you. This is actually where it all took place. Her mission was to burn down two buildings that were made of wood that had 200 of the Nazi soldiers in. So she was caught, tortured, and then walked the next morning to some gallows that they put up and hung in front of the whole village, where she hung for 3 months and was then chopped down and mutilated. The story got to Stalin that she didn't give up and didn't tell them where they were hidden, and so after that she became a martyr for this war effort. So a symbol for everybody to keep fighting. After this episode, there was the Great Battle of Moscow, which was the seminal moment when the Russians pushed back the Nazis, which is also part of our story. And then the aftermath, when you have a hero, they named a star after her. They named a mountain range after her. There were films, narrative films made of her, stamps, statues, you name it. And there's also what's beautiful about this building, as I'll show you, is the special windows that you look through where you can see where she was hung, where she was tortured, and then there is a statue to her in honor of her as well through another window. So it's an interesting museum where you're telling a story about somebody on the inside that is also reflected on the outside for those moments and when you want to sit and really reflect on what happened. And so by its nature, we were very fortunate, right? We have an incredible story, we have a plot, we have a lead character, we have the Nazis. And so how do you tell a story like this? So how do you really reach people and resonate with them? And so we wanted to tell, we thought what it must have been like for her emotionally before the war happened. So we start the story off in a room that I'll show you now, which is very much about what it was like back then, what it must have felt like as a 17-year-old with all the industry, the trade, the arts, the cinema, what books she read. We have all of her notebooks, all her school books. She loved Shakespeare, she loved poetry, calculus, really making sure that people who visit the museum understand and can relate to her. And there was a lot of primarily school groups going to be coming. So after we established sort of what it was like before she was enlisted, then we cut to this is her classroom down here. And we wanted to do a classroom by day and then a big AV installation that would change, and you would hear all the tanks rolling in, the lights flicker, you hear the Nazis shouting and yelling, and then the docent asks you to open up the desk in front of you, and then you learn how to use a compass, and you are put first person in Zoya's perspective on what really they were taught over those 3 days. Obviously, it's just some highlights, enabled you to understand and feel what it must have been like to be her. And then you move out of that space and you go into a third space, which is about the mission she was on with her friends and what they faced as they were being shot at by the Nazis. And then we have artifacts, and we recreated where she was actually kept. We have her bench where she was tortured. We have recollections of members of the community there. So you really feel what it must have been like for her. And then we have the moment when she was hanged. And when you sit here, you actually look through the window at the space where it all happened. So after that moment of repose, you go into a trench where we reenact the whole Battle of Moscow here, and then you go through here. This is a fun moment where you get to be in the barracks and experience some of the food. And then this final area here is about Zoya and her aftermath, her legacy, sort of what she provided to the people afterwards. And the final space, because when we're telling these stories in history, you always have to make sure that you can relate it to today. Like, why now? Why is it important? Why should I care? And so one of the things that I know happens with a lot of the allies is, you remember the last day of the war, and specifically in Russia, a lot of the grandchildren will walk down the streets in huge parades holding their ancestors, visuals of those who died or were in the war. And so we created an interactive here where you could go record yourself and your family story and be featured up there. So very much keeping this story current and top of mind. You'll notice in the middle of the space when I was talking about linear stories, this is a very linear story, but it's a very emotional and hard story. And so we wanted to make sure that there was this central area that at any point from any of the spaces, you can come into it and sit and reflect and have space. And also I'll show you these spaces. This is one of the places that's the very beginning of the story. It's all about the fun, what was happening, the sport, the labor. Again, you see less is more. A small vitrine, big visuals, not tons of stuff. We really wanted to get people to get the feel and the vibe of what was going on here. And you'll see to the left again, we selected very few images to help tell the story. What are the important things? You want to see a family, you want to see a school, you want to see her writings. So again, sifting things right down. This is just a little quick animatics just to show you sort of as we were building the classroom, which is all to scale and based on all old artifacts and old photographs that we took. This is the real one. I think it's always really cool when when what you plan actually comes out exactly what you hope for. But you can see here that the whole classroom would shake and the windows to the left would be flashing, and you would hear the narrative outside and the tanks running in, and then the lights would come on again and the docent instructs you to open the desk and learn. Just jumping forward to the trench that I mentioned for the battle, this is a good example of utilizing media to help tell a story. So we thought, what is it? What is the story we're trying to tell about this moment? And from reading reflections about it, it was how this was tanks were used a lot, and obviously there was a lot of planes for the first time used in World War II. So it's that feeling of being trapped in a trench and these tanks coming towards you. So it's basically about 130, 140 degree screen with 3D of the actual battle that happened. So we recreated, this is just an example of some of the media that played on there. Okay, so again, very filmic as we told the story and people were inside this trench. They really, again, felt what it must have been like to be a soldier in there. And that didn't have a heavy voiceover. It's not documentary-like. It's just very light touch with that. This is the last room I was saying, where people could go into a booth, scan a picture of their ancestor, record a story or type a story in, and then it got shared after it was curated by the museum staff. And then again, making sure that when you're telling stories, especially heart-rendering ones like this, that there is a neutral space, a place to be able to reset emotionally, or talk and share stories was hugely important. And when you think about design, we had to fight for this very light. Some people may notice this floor is incredibly light, and most people like a darker gray, but we really wanted it to feel very clean, very minimal, and very uplifting. And there's those windows that I mentioned within the building, which were actually ultimately in the perfect place, because obviously media windows, architects getting a better understanding of the fact that please don't put windows everywhere. It's really hard for us to do our work, but they worked really well in this case. So yeah, this was a very interesting, tough story to tell. So I'm just going to pause now in case Brad and I thought maybe would anybody have any questions about this and telling stories like this?
Yeah, I think I mean, just the intensity of that story kind of puts me in the headspace of the visitor to this place. Just this presentation is incredibly intense. I almost want a white room where I could just sit and absorb what you just shared. Yeah, this is a great time to pause. If anybody has a question, feel free to drop it in the chat. If you're comfortable, you can ask Abby your own question, or I'm happy to read it. I personally, I have probably an entire 2 pages of questions. So Abby, you and I are definitely going to have to get coffee or a drink in New York, because I'm brimming over with questions. Kurt in the chat. Kurt, do you want to just jump on mic and ask your question?
Hi, this is Kurt from London. I just had a question, because the story gets very dark when you're talking about the torture and the hanging. How do you decide to go? How dark do you decide to go? How do you make that decision, and what goes into it?
There's a lot of conversations. So this story is actually common knowledge over there. Obviously, she was huge in Russia. So, and if you Google it, the images are all over the internet. So it's always the age-old question, right? If it's all over the internet, why, when we suddenly select it out and hold it up in an institution or an instance like this, or even in a movie, does everybody seem to have a conniption about it? Because it is interesting. It's like human nature. When things are out there, but they're out there with everything else, or you could just access them, it's not a big deal. When somebody actually puts it in front of you, front and center, suddenly the context is so insignificant. So we chose in this instance, understanding the brutality of the story and the fact that everybody had seen a lot of the images, maybe not the youth, to actually show it. Because we thought that was going to be the most effective way to drill home what she'd endured and the brutality of the Nazis and the Nazi regime and what they'd put people through as they tried to dominate and conquer. And so we chose to show the picture of the hanging quite large, rather than show an old photograph of it, because we wanted to also make this place and space something very different to what you can get on the internet. And I think one of the privileges we have as a group, as a profession, is being able to highlight in new ways things that you can access, right? Because a lot of you will tell stories that are out there already. And the challenge is, how do you make people rethink them? How do you stop people feeling numb? Because that's what you do. You go online, you look at them, they're horrific, but there you go. So making people think about brutality, what we do to each other, what it really means to be a hero, to stand up for yourself, to endure, was one of the things that motivated us to show it. And hoping that we got people in the right frame and done the setup correctly for that moment. So it's not about the shock, it's about the meaning and the reflection.
I'm going to jump in with a really quick question, Abby. This is one of my first notes that I made as you're talking is, even as you noted, sort of like it's a common sort of like component or an element of storytelling, conflict.
Yeah.
You know, your hero, your protagonist, whatever, they experience conflict, they're changed, they discover something about themselves, all this stuff.
Yeah.
And this kind of relates a little bit to a question that's showing up in the chat here, is like, as a storyteller and a crafter of these experiences, to what degree do you feel challenging the visitor or the user is a factor? Is it essential? Is it non-essential? How do you gauge the degree to which you want to actually sort of take on this challenge? Like, this is a particularly intense story. Most stories are kind of like kind of a few steps back from this. But like, as a storyteller, what is our responsibility to actually challenge people?
I think we definitely have a responsibility. Oh, I feel I have a responsibility to challenge people. That's exactly what we do. Yeah, I think yes, I mean, I think that's part of the problem. I think that we are so polarized in our thinking or our perspective that we need to come together and connect and listen and hear each other. And you do that through challenging preconceived ideas, because otherwise we're all set then, right? We've got nothing left to learn. We know it all from our perspective. And I would rather personally as well, in order to grow and learn and evolve every day of my life, you have to be challenged. If you're not challenged, how are you progressing? So I think that's why we're constantly trying to, yes, challenge people. That is 100% what we're trying to do. And sometimes we're not successful. It hasn't worked for one reason or another. Sometimes it can be successful with a group and not with another group. I mean, that's one of the challenges I think about what we're doing, is that there's so diverse groups of people with diverse backgrounds and baggage that come into our spaces. But you also need to challenge people in a way that they are open to accepting it. So it's not confrontation, definitely not confrontation. It is through that empathy and understanding, or sharing different perspectives, which is, I think, why story is such a great way of doing that.
Yeah, I'm going to +1 that a whole bunch of times. Riffing on that though, Kenzie, you had a question in the chat and it's sort of related. Do you just want to ask that directly, or I'm happy to read it out?
Yeah, absolutely. Throughout the creation of this beautiful experience, what was included in the testing phase to ensure that the visitor experience was what was intended or envisioned? So maybe focus groups, prototypes, etc.
That is a fantastic question. And I forgot to mention, the whole thing happened, the whole build out after the design phase during COVID. So it was horrific for us. So that is such a great, so we didn't do the scale of prototyping that we wished we'd been able to do. But that, unfortunately, yes, in this one case, unfortunately, with COVID happening, yeah, it made this project very, very hard to bring to life.
Were there any gotchas? Were there any of these things where sort of your design team kind of was building towards an expectation, a visitor experience, and you were surprised? I mean, positively, negatively, anything. I'm just really curious because that's such a anyone who is building large scale projects during COVID can relate to this, just how hard it was to validate our design assumptions.
Yeah. Especially yes, there was, especially in the classroom, with the AV and all the lighting design and that moment when the tanks came in. We ideally had wanted to put screens in, so you look through the real windows out, and it was going to be an entire screen, so it would feel very real. But in the end, because of supply chains, we couldn't get those screens that we needed. So we had to pivot and change it to more like a light installation with gobos. It still had sound there, but it wasn't our ultimate vision, which would have been a lot more visual. It was more sensory and emotional. So it still used light and sound. And in all of our work, we really try to use all of the senses because they can really transport you, especially smell is just crazy. And I'm going to present a project which really utilizes that. But you can tell an amazing story without the need of video, so but when you have the vision, as we all know, and you imagine exactly what's going to happen, and then you sort of have to settle, that was a bit of a settling moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure. Speaking of the smell project, I kind of want to get to another one of these case studies because I'm really curious. We were talking about the diversity of the projects you wanted to walk through. There's a
Yep.
ton of great questions remaining in the chat. I kind of want to move to the next case study, but with that in mind, I got Abby's okay on this. Feel free to reach out to her on LinkedIn. If you have a question, you want to speak directly with her about any of these and you want to dig into it, please do. Abby, that's cool with you?
100%. Yes. Yeah. We're here to help each other. So that's how I feel. So definitely reach out. More than happy to answer and chat and everything. Yeah. About this crazy topic. So I'm going to move to our Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Verizon project that we did, which is completely different. So should I start? You have this very, very grand, very historic, very white building in a location that wants to really appeal to a more diverse visitor who doesn't feel like they can associate very well with what Cooper Hewitt's putting out from the outside, right? They don't see themselves as part of this place. And at the same time, they felt that they had millions, they had at the time 3 million artifacts online available for research, not really getting used, brought to life. So we were challenged along with a couple of other different companies to bring these things to life. And so it was fantastic. So again, what do we start with? What's the story? You can see just in the background here, they have artifacts and design from forever, from everywhere. And so what we started off doing was actually a lot of fun. It was trying to find out groups of artifacts that could form a holistic story. And we ended up telling the story and curating 1912, which in the Belle Epoque in Paris. And so we found multiple different objects. And again, we didn't want to curate all the same objects, all chairs, or there was one moment where we had all baseball hats, which was a lot of fun, but it felt like one tone. We wanted to put these artifacts inside a space where they would be brought to life. A lot of what we feel old museums are like is they have their artifact, it's on a pedestal, there is zero context. You can read about it, but it hardly really brings it to life. It hardly really tells a meaningful story that resonates. So we thought what would be incredibly fun when we thought about the audience we needed to appeal to would be to make, bring a collection, tell a story out on the streets around New York so that everybody could engage with history and find it fun and also important to where we are today. So when we're thinking about the story, one of the other reasons why we chose La Belle Epoque is because it's called the Golden Era. And that was because it had the golden era of medicine, when you think about Mary Curie, and it had the golden era of technology back then, and then it had the golden era of science and music and culture. Very much, I feel like what the explosion that is happening over here, and we'd had COVID, and so the amazing leaps that have happened with medicine there. So there's a lot of similarities, and so drawing on this time in the past that has a lot of similarities with the current time, and collectivizing these objects together to help tell the story of what a family would be like back then, and also bring these objects to life was very important. So actually, I'll show you this. One of the challenges, I think it stopped. One of the challenges was my little cursor, sorry. Was bringing to life these objects. So we just had a flat photo, just one single photograph, and they gave us a dimension, and that was it. And so we couldn't even go in and see them. We couldn't look at anything. We had to sort of create it just based on that photograph. So we built all of these artifacts. One of the other really important things about this project was we didn't want people on a phone just zooming in. We wanted people to be able to walk through the space. So we decided to have a portal that would open up on the street, and you would walk inside and you would actually feel the three-dimensionality of the space, and you would walk up to the objects, and then there would be a very little short, sweet, succinct, as if your friend's speaking to you, pop-up that would explain very briefly the significance of the object, and finish by asking you a question relevant to you today. So a music room, it's kind of like, we called it like the hangout space. And so people could actually interact with that object and then think about a concurrent object or a concurrent moment in their life that resonates with them, that this family could have been doing back in Labelli Park. So every object told a story in this case, and then they all came together to tell an overall story. Again, this is just sort of showing, building it up. One of the challenges with this was polygon count, making it light enough, because one of our big pet peeves is when you're loading anything that has high fidelity, it takes forever and users are just gone. Like if you're not in immediately, you're gone. And so working on that, working with the consultants on the carpet decoration, the wallpaper, really trying to get everything spot on. And then lighting, I do just want to talk about, it's not specific about story, but I think it really affects the feeling and enhances your story, is lighting in our work. Again, coming from a film background, we often use lighting to help tell story. So it was very important. I'll just jump to the end. I don't know if you can see here. There's a lot of light coming in, a warm, glowing, lovely, nostalgic light. Again, all trying to get everybody sort of immersed in the story. And then whenever, I know you all know this, whenever you're thinking about apps or any sort of interactive, this is the prelude. It's like the intro to the story. The onboarding is critical. Again, short and sweet. Hey, traveler, before you step back in time, here's what you should know. A doorway will appear and you'll navigate into a room and learn about 6 artifacts from the Smithsonian Open Access Collection. For the best experience, we recommend finding an open space and turning your sound on. And there it is. And so in you go, and there's little pop-ups with a little question about what your favorite seat is. We worked with Sina Barham and his team to make sure that this was accessible to everyone. Anybody with sight issues could use all the audio music and audio cues, and vice versa. If you couldn't hear very well, there was visual cues. So we worked a lot on making sure that it was accessible. So when we think about story, we think about story throughout an entire experience. And so these are the geolocators in the accessibility features, and a lot of them use tone. So as you get closer to a subject, the user knows it goes bing, 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 that they're getting closer. My biggest advice to everybody is don't try and reinvent the wheel. There is a set language that they're used to. Do what they used to. You don't have to do anything different, because they need to be able to use whatever you've made in a very seamless, intuitive way. But I did want to play one thing that I thought was interesting creatively because it didn't work. And I love sharing things that don't work. So we have a harpsichord in the room. And so we're like, oh, it would be great if the locator could be a harpsichord tone. So we were playing around. I hope you can hear that with this sort of sound. Can you guys hear that? No. Okay, it's a harpsichord. Yeah, I think I haven't turned my sound. It's a harpsichord tone, like bing. But when you played it quickly, it sounded awful. So we're like, oh no. So we settled on more of like a ding. Sorry, I'm rubbish at singing. More like a ting, which was still musical and still felt very much of the time. But it's interesting how you sort of have to tailor things and change them, even when you're trying to tell stories in a holistic way. So, and then also one of the other important things, again, thinking about less is more, is the entry points for these experiences. Where are they going to be, either inside the museum, outside of the museum, and how do people get into that experience? In this case, obviously it was an app on a phone. It was going to be a QR code. Have you time traveled today? One of the questions from Kenzie earlier is sort of about testing. We tested multiple different calls to action because stopping people in New York City is impossible. Trying to get them to do anything, virtually impossible. And so we did really want to test this to make sure that we had an interesting enough hook that some people would actually stop and want to see, you know, what's all this about. And so this point of entry, we did actually test it, and this one came up tops again. Plain, simple. We're big believers from a marketing perspective on that. It always wins through. So I'm just going to jump through this really quickly because there's some cool things I want to show you. This is just in our office. There goes the door, pop out, open it comes, and you can see that light. You see how it really sets the scene for this room, and that's the little pop-up that comes up that tells you what to expect. So through here. Oh yeah, I just want to, so you can sort of see the room. Lots of people have asked us about this in terms of like, would you guys want to white label it? Because it has so many uses. If you have a museum that's temporarily closed, you can exhibit artifacts, people can use it on the web. And it's a really nice way of bringing these stories to life when you show collections of artifacts the way that they used to be used. We haven't found a way yet, so I'm open to any suggestions because everything here is custom. Like the detail on the side of this harpsichord is like nuts that the team was able to recreate some things like that. And so we haven't been able to white label it because it's too custom, unfortunately. But again, really, really open to some suggestions. I do just want to show you one really cool factor associated with this that I think is awesome. Is when you see the door out to reality. That's our office. There's something magical about this. I'm like, it does feel like you've stepped back in time. And when you're looking around the space where you see reality there. So it was just really like a very nice moment for us, I think. I don't know, it's crazy. I just love this moment. So yeah, that's that project. Again, completely different with different challenges, but yeah.
That's super fascinating. I love how like there's this very physical, sort of like deep story that you're engaging in on one level, and then this project is virtual, fabricated digital content. I think God, I have so many questions. Stefan had a question, and I don't know if Stefan is still here in the chat, but was asking earlier about sort of like the consideration between sort of a physical build out versus a virtual build out.
Yeah.
And as a storytelling methodology, what do you see as sort of like the affordances of one path versus the other?
That's a great question, Brad. I think our industry's at the very beginnings, but I think when you're talking about being in virtual reality or augmented reality, it's really just been born. I think it has so many limitations right now to feel like this immersion and surrounded by the story, mainly because it's device driven, right? And you can't have things like touch and smell yet. I know it's all coming, it's all gonna be there, and VR is more advanced and can able to do that than AR. So you know, I think that there's a lot a lot of things that you sacrifice when you're doing these all digital, all these immersive worlds, which is why I was talking to Jamie Lawyer about the Rubin and how docents are so important often to the visitor experience for one reason or another, however they're getting used. But without that, how can you have a docent, an AI, somebody guide you in a digital experience without it just feeling like you're going through images and nothing's getting enhanced and nothing feels like it's emotionally resonating with you because you're not physically in the space. Physicality has a huge lot to do with being in spaces and also being in a community with people around you. So I think they're just very different right now. I think we have a long way in the digital space to even get to what we're doing in 3D space. But I do think it's great in terms of it's very local, physical space. This enables a lot of democratization around the world and being able to tell stories that reach more people. And so that reach and being able to create things and share them around the world. It's efficient, it saves money, and you can touch and still move people. Again, it's just in its rudimentary beginnings, but I think there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of legs with it there when you're trying to tell stories beyond the confines of a building.
That's great, thanks. Kind of thinking within sort of like standard museum metrics too. There's a lot of talk about dwell time.
Yeah.
Dwell time is this sort of like this indication of depth of experience. I'm curious to hear like whether you think time spent with an exhibit or a particular experience is the best metric, or is there something else that you consider in terms of like maybe not time spent but depth of experience? Like how do you, for some reason your work has got me thinking about this idea that sort of like maybe time spent, like 20 minutes in an experience isn't the unicorn kind of scenario, but maybe a 2-minute deep experience can be ideal. Like how do you and your company think about time versus depth? I guess that's the question.
Yep. That's yes, we think about it exactly that way. I think you can tell a very compelling story in 2 minutes. Yeah, you can tell it. I mean, very compelling story in 15 seconds, or you can tell it with an image. I think it's the way that you are unfolding the story and the way that you're telling that moment that's really important. So you could be in an experience and go through it in 20 minutes, but those core moments that really resonate, because you can't be resonating the whole time, right? Like in a movie, it's not one moment after a moment, otherwise you'd be absolutely exhausted and I think your brain shuts down. So again, it's key to make sure that there's dramatic high points and low point and less dramatic moments. But I 100% do think that yes, dwell time needs to be thought about maybe as an overall immersion in the museum or the institution, but those dwell time in moments, I think, yes, it does. You can have a very deep moment that resonates for the rest of your life that occurs over 15 seconds, a minute, yes, 2 minutes. Mm-hmm.
God, thank you.
That's a great question though, Brad, actually.
I just think about metrics a lot, and how do we evaluate these experiences that we're designing?
Yeah.
Really quickly, because I'm a rubbish host and I bounced out of Zoom earlier, I wanted to actually share before I forget. Hold on a second. I wanted to share some of the other things that are going to be happening through Future Spaces. Let me see. Let me do this really quickly because this is important stuff. And then we're going to come back to maybe one last question. Just keep in mind these live talks and workshops are happening every week. All the past recordings, including Abby's, which will probably be posted within the next week. Josh has also started Art World. If you haven't followed that, it is kind of the art space equivalent to the Future Spaces conversations. Really fascinating stuff going on there. Then I believe, was it next week, Catherine Hackle will be joining us, talking about mixed reality, and a workshop coming up, Unlocking the Power of Generative AI for Museum Educators, which sounds incredible to me. So there we go. I did my due diligence. Now, if there's anything final you want to share, Abby, with the group, something that we can all keep in mind and take into our next nonlinear sort of narrative storytelling experience?
Yeah, I think that the main thing is to think about story as soon as you can. Think about whose story you're telling, and what the conflict is. And that's one of the main things. And then think about the drama throughout the space and how you're going to tell those moments. And it's not necessarily through media.
Oof, I love that last point. We kind of lean on technology and media as the thing that, like, we commit to the media before we commit to the story. Love this idea. Figure out what are the dramatic elements, then the best platform to deliver that message. We're smack at 2 o'clock. Abby, thank you so much for sharing. Josh, when he logs in someday to see this video, thank you, Josh, for letting me join.
Yeah, thank
If you want to follow up with Abby, please drop her a note on LinkedIn.
Yep.
That'd be great.
And thanks all. Thanks, Abby, and thanks everybody for joining us for an hour today.
Thank you, Brad. Thanks everybody for joining. Thank you so much. Shoot over any questions.
Have a great Thursday.
Yeah, have a great day. Have a great weekend.